We're Sainties.
St. Elizabeth University.
St. Elizabeth is the best kept secret in New Jersey. Here, turn your passion into your profession. St. E's has one goal: to support intelligent, determined young women and men, becoming the best people they are destined to be.
The power to learn.
The power to grow.
The power to succeed.
We're St. E's.
St. Elizabeth University. The power to soar.
Welcome, everyone, to our inaugural Community of Learners podcast here at St. Elizabeth University, brought to you by Faculty Affairs Committee. Today, we're going to explore the relationship between science, the sciences, and the humanities. We have some great guests with us. But on the topic of the relationship between sciences and humanities, I'd like to give a quick plug to Cultivating Ensembles. Cultivating Ensembles is a vibrant community of scientists, educators, artists, performers, researchers, students, advocates, and entrepreneurs from across academia, the arts, industry, business, and nonprofits. They create playful, collaborative spaces to explore and advance STEAM education and research, celebrating the connections between the arts, humanities, and the sciences. Cultivating Ensembles will be hosting their in-person conference from July 24th to July 26th here at St. Elizabeth University in Morristown, New Jersey. And they're still accepting fair share proposals for the conference. You can learn more and register at cultivatingensembles.org. As I noted, our focus today is the relationship between science and the humanities. And we have three excellent guests with us today to help us in this exploration. I'm going to take a few moments to introduce them. Dr. Julia Olayanju is an assistant professor of biological sciences and biochemistry at St. Elizabeth University. She's also the founder of Food Niche Ed, which develops technology tools and resources to enhance science and nutrition education for K-12 students. Dr. Richard Quinlan is an assistant professor and chair of the history department at St. Elizabeth University. He's also the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Education. And finally, Dr. Glen Sherman is an associate professor of psychology and the chair of the psychology department. He was also recently awarded tenure at St. Elizabeth University. So congratulations, Dr. Sherman, on that. All right, so let's dive in and see what our guests have to share. Dr. Olayanju, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. Your research ties together science and culture by focusing on food and the role of culture in food choices and health outcomes. Can you explain how food brings these different fields together for us?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for that good question. One of the key things that people think about when we think about food is think about how it nourishes us, the micronutrients, the macronutrients it provides. But beyond that, food also affects us on a lower level, on a molecular level, in terms of how exactly do we treat diseases, how do we manage diseases. But what influences how we eat? And that's where culture comes in. A lot of children grow up in homes where the parents eat in a particular way. And that's the first introduction they have to food. They eat exactly what their parents eat. They live in neighborhoods where people do things in a particular way. They're shaped by that neighborhood, by that culture in which they've grown. So that's one fundamental way. So we might be thinking, let's focus more on how we can help people to eat better so that they can live healthier. But we need to understand how the factors around them shape their choices so that we can better intervene and better recommend what will work in a sustainable way. So beyond culture and food, and also food and health outcomes, it's also important to know the role of socioeconomic status in the way people eat. And one of the key things that we've seen over the years is that we see some health outcomes in some communities. And when you look closely at those communities, you see that there are some conditions around them, such as food insecurity, poor access to produce and food. So when you look at the conditions they have, you think about how you can improve access, how you can tackle food insecurity issues before you can go further and say, I want to help them eat better. So there are many elements that come into play when you think about food and health outcomes. There are factors such as culture that shape how we eat. There's also the environmental, socioeconomic status that also influences that as well. So they're all intertwined. And when we think about their final outcome, those are factors that play a key role there.
That's really, really interesting. And we're eventually going to open the floor, just so everyone knows, for all of you to address each other's topics, which I'm really looking forward to hearing. But before that, I want to hear a bit about Dr. Quinlan and Dr. Sherman's research interests. Dr. Quinlan, your research focuses heavily on the Holocaust, but also addresses just the unfortunate phenomenon of genocide in general. So I want to ask, what kind of questions do you find yourself asking most in the wake of genocides, especially at the intersection of history and the sciences?
I think the most common question that I find and that people have in general is, how exactly do people buy into a concept of a genocide? Because what we've seen now, obviously, what we saw in Nazi Germany is the most extreme example, and we understand the manipulation and the use of propaganda and how a government sanctions this mass atrocity. And of course, the Holocaust stands alone because we've never seen a genocide that's as mechanized and industrialized. In other genocides, for example, Rwanda or Burundi, we saw neighbor killing neighbor. Now, fundamentally, they began the same way, because it starts with the power of language. It starts with propaganda. And also the idea, and certainly Dr. Sherman can speak to this as well, that idea of sort of the illusory truth effect, where a lie, and I know this is a quote that's attributed to many people, but certainly Goebbels used it certainly to drive the Nazi message, that a lie told enough times eventually becomes the truth. And that is true in every single genocide. What makes the study of genocide so frustrating is that it's the same playbook every single time. You start with a target, you dehumanize, you then begin to label and separate people within society. And it is that dehumanization through language that then creates that concept of the other. And you create a group that is not just considered to be outsiders, but dangerous and a threat to. You will eventually reach the point where people believe if that group is eliminated, then we'll have the society that we want. And so the fundamental question really is, what drives us as human beings to buy into that concept? And what could actually lead someone, whether it was in Nazi Germany and people turning in their neighbors, people that they've lived next to or whose shops they frequented, or in other genocide where honestly it is that person you have lived next door to for your entire life, and now you're there in their home, killing them, truly staring them in the face as you do it. What is it about human nature that drives us and allows us to participate in that?
And that's a fantastic question. And I certainly want to unpack that more. And Dr. Sherman, I imagine you'll have some things to say about that, and Dr. Olayanju's comments as well. But before we get to that, I'm really interested in your work in both humanistic psychology and narrative identity. Can you unpack these ideas for us?
Sure. So, the history of psychology is a funny mixture of different kinds of sciences. So when psychology first started, back in the late 1800s, it tried to model itself after the natural sciences. So the successes of physics and chemistry and biology were very influential. And so even though it had come out of a tradition of philosophy, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, it felt that it needed to legitimize itself, model itself on the natural sciences, the experimental sciences. At the same time, there was another tradition in psychology that said what would be more appropriate for a human science, for a psychology that fits who we are as human beings, should mirror the humanities, should mirror interpretation theory, should measure the human sciences. And there were theorists that had developed the human sciences and interpretation in disciplines like history and literature and biblical interpretation, a variety of humanities. And so even though it was the quieter voice, it did develop. And even though the louder voice in psychology has been the natural science approach, the experimental approach, with perspectives in psychology like humanistic psychology, like Carl Rogers' client-centered therapy, which most people have heard of, it has maintained a presence. That all said, narrative theory is very relevant because it looks at the way we conceptualize ourselves, the way we think about our histories, the way we think about our bodies, etc., in terms of the stories we tell about ourselves. So human identity can be thought about in terms of the stories we come to tell about ourselves, the way we understand our personal histories, and even, again, our bodies, our embodied experiences. So that's the way I think about all those things coming together.
Great. Well, as you can tell, we have really three interesting perspectives here. And the question is, how do we see how they overlap and how do we see how we fit together? So I have some questions I'd like to ask and then let the dialogue kind of unfold naturally, hopefully. But let me start, Dr. Olayanju and Dr. Sherman, with both of you. It seems like culture shapes food experiences and food experiences shape culture and identity in a narrative sense. So 2 questions, and then let's see how that unfolds. For Dr. Olayanju, can you speak to how personal and cultural identities are shaped by food experiences? And then Dr. Sherman, to follow up on that, I'm wondering if you can connect these to humanistic psychology. Why is it important to think about the relationship between food choices and cultural factors and personal narratives, rather just than sort of the standard natural sciences? How do we blend all those together? Dr. Olayanju.
Yes. So one important thing that we all know is that our culture speaks a lot to us. It makes us people identify with what they do and what their people believe. So some people tell you, we don't eat that. Who are we? I'm talking just about you. No, we don't eat that. In my family, this is how we eat. I remember there was a particular time I went to lunch with a friend, and she told me she's never had meat before because she was raised in a family that believe that they should not eat that. For religious reasons, they should. So all her life, she's never had that. So it's something she identifies strongly with, and it's something she protects as well. And that's just a reflection of a lot of people when they grow up and how they grow up and what that culture shapes and dictates influences the way they think and the choices they make. So it affects people in a positive way, and in some cases it affects them in a negative way. But the bottom line is culture influences choices. When it comes to food, food is something that connects people. And when people want to celebrate, they think about going for dinner together. When they have milestones, they just think about what we can do around food. So that's a very important part of our day-to-day lives. But in terms of how and what people eat, culture plays an integral role. And then when people also decide that they want to move away, of course, initially there's that initial instant that, okay, this is something I've always known, but it's not ideal for me. Maybe knowledge has caught up. That's a new culture. When you expose yourself to information and information transforms your mind, you start thinking differently and acting differently. I know from personal experience that for many years, I had a way of eating. I had my experiences with food. But the more I acquired knowledge, the more my thinking changed, the more my choices changed. And I believe that it's a new culture, it's a new way of doing things that's evolved, for me in particular, evolved mainly because of the new culture I've embraced. So bottom line to your question is, yes, culture is very, very integral to the way we do things. And when it comes to food in particular, it does influence our choices and how we approach food.
Excellent, thank you. And Dr. Sherman, can you expand a little bit about why it's important to think along those lines, how culture and that impacts these kinds of choices?
Yeah, I agree with the perspective. I mean, think about the stories that people tell themselves, whether at a cultural level, a familial level, or even an individual level. People who are vegan or vegetarian, for instance, if you ask them why, they will tell you a story about the health benefits, the ways it affects the planet, the environment, all the different perspectives and implications that there are. Think too of holiday celebrations. How frequently holiday celebrations involve certain foods and the stories that we tell about certain foods. I think of a Seder, and the different foods that have symbolic significance for the story that goes along with it. So I agree that these choices that we make about our dietary habits are very much involved with those connections to familial culture, to broader culture, and the stories that we tell related to our food choices.
I think it's fascinating that food has so much to do with then identity because it's so tied into culture. And if you want to know yourself, you have to know the culture in which you live. You almost have to sort of like interpret the self within that context. And I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, and or some people reject the culture that they've come from, the story that they've grown up with, and create a different story, which entails a diametrically opposed series of food choices,
but still in response to that culture. And that sort of brings me, I want to bring Dr. Quinlan into this conversation because it raises a question for me, like what happens when culture and meal are like disrupted to the point of obliteration? And I think this is what you see in part happening in places of both extreme poverty and places of genocide. So you think about the concentration camps in Nazi Germany and surrounding areas, particularly I'm thinking of Poland. So Dr. Quinlan, this raises a question. Can you tell us a little bit about the food conditions that were common in concentration camps like Dachau and Auschwitz-Birkenau? And then I want to explore like Dr. Olayanju, if you can talk about like biologically what's happening in those cases. Let's explore that a little bit.
No, certainly. I mean, there have been a lot of conversations about food in terms of it being obviously nutrients, but also celebratory. And what the Nazis did is they applied a tremendous amount of science into trying to discover just what was the bare minimum that a person could be fed that would allow them to work. And what they discovered is that there were 3 meals a day, if you want to use that word and use the word meal rather loosely. Prisoners in the morning would be served either this sort of thin herbal tea or this sort of coffee substitute. There would be a soup at lunch that if you were a new prisoner in particular, it was found to be almost unedible. It was really horrific. It was a potato-based soup, but many new prisoners could not adjust to the taste. So therefore, they're starving even more quickly. And then the evening meal, which was supposed to last you through the next day, was on average 300 grams of this, kind of older black bread with maybe a little bit of sausage thrown in, about 25 grams or so. And this was done very, very intentionally because it would allow prisoners to live. It was enough to subsist, barely. But then when we think of the Holocaust, many of us who when we think of images of it, it's the sort of living skeleton, emaciated bodies, which were actually referred to as musclemen by the Nazis. And that was a person who was right on the verge of physical exhaustion and death. And when you had reached that physical point, that's usually when you would then be selected for gas chambers. And so everything the Nazis did scientifically, whether we want to think about the application of eugenics and the creation of the so-called Übermensch or the Superman, through the medical experiments by Mengele, right to the discovery of how many grams of bread could a person be fed to keep them alive just enough to get through a period of whether it be weeks or months. Because if you look at some of the lifespans of prisoners, on average, when people were arriving at Auschwitz, they survived maybe a few months or somewhere 3 to 6 months. Yeah.
And I think that's really cool because not cool, but I mean, the idea there behind that is what happens when you take food. You forget about culture, you forget about identity, you forget about humanity, and you just take it down to utility and nothing else. I mean, it's sort of the ultimate dehumanization, right? Because you're just feeding machines in your mind. That's what you're doing. And Dr. Olayanju, I kind of want to go to you for a minute and say, biologically, what happens to the body in those conditions, in those situations where you have that low amount of carbohydrates going in? Like, what happens to the body, the brain? How does that affect us?
Yes. So most of the time when people eat for different reasons. When you are in a state of abundance, that's under normal circumstances, you have food, you have snack, you have your regular meals, you just eat to sometimes for pleasure, but in most cases, your body has an expectation because you have physiological needs that the food you consume meets. Now, when we move from a state of abundance to a state of scarcity, like Dr. Richard just mentioned, one of the key things that happens is that the body starts breaking down all those stored deposits that it's made. So during abundance, when you eat, there's some of those meals that, for instance, you take carbohydrates, it's broken down, and you have glycogen being stored up. And then you get to a state where you are forced to eat something a lot smaller than you normally would, or something not even palatable to you. Then you get to a point that your body still has those needs. So it starts breaking down all the stored deposits that you have. And then it gets to a point that you've broken it all down, you're not replenishing anything. And to the point you made a few seconds ago, people find it difficult to carry out normal function. And then in the case of concentration camps that you see, going by the example you just gave, they start thinking they can't do the work they want them to do anymore. They're not physically strong enough to do the work because all the storage, all the stored deposits that you have has been used up. You've not replenished, or you've not replenished as you should. So there's nothing to work with. And physiologically, your function is impaired. And at this point, sometimes some people find it very difficult to even stand up. They're that weak. So many things happen in our bodies, and as a result of the food we eat. And we can think about it from bigger ways and broader ways. But the bottom line is, if someone is being denied food, then the problem comes in because they can't function, they can't support their body's physiological functions, and they can't function properly as they should. So starvation eventually can actually lead to death.
Let me go to Dr. Sherman, and then Dr. Quinlan, I want to come back to you. So we're talking about a situation here where you're reducing food to just utility, and it's not even enough until someone becomes, in Hitler's words, quote unquote, useless eaters, I think was an expression that he used, and then they're taken to extermination through some means. How do we make sense of that from a standpoint of narrative identity? I mean, does there come a point where you can the story that you tell yourself no longer makes sense? I mean, how does narrative identity speak to those situations?
So what I think of is Viktor Frankl's book, The Man's Search for Meaning. And while all this is of course true, that there comes a point where the body gives out because of it's so depleted, he, as a psychiatrist in the concentration camps, he was in the concentration camps himself, noticed that those who retained hope despite the horrific conditions, the deadly conditions, those who retained their hope, who somehow were able to do that, lived longer. And he actually, based on and so his role there was to try to impart meaning even in the face of those horrific conditions. And out of that effort, he actually developed logotherapy. He survived, and he lived beyond the concentration camps and the liberation of the concentration camps, and went on to become a famous psychotherapist, and wrote that book, Man's Search for Meaning, and based his psychotherapy on the aspect of hope that's so important. Man's search for meaning. That meaning, even in the face of such dire conditions, still plays a role until the body gives out and Obviously, hope is no longer possible.
Right.
But there were different responses. Some people, in the face of those physiological conditions, could not maintain hope.
Right.
Others could and did.
Right. So it's almost like existentially, the narrative is essential to our survival
Yes.
as human persons.
Yes. And do we know how that works exactly? Why it's different for one person than another?
Right.
Probably not.
Right.
But it was experienced and it was witnessed.
Dr. Quinlan, I'm curious, like these perspectives coming in, because I mean, obviously, when you're talking about something like the Holocaust, there's so many different fields of study that need to come into play. Speaking to what Dr. Olayanju and Dr. Sherman has brought to the table, like I want to hear some more thoughts from you on how these play into your field.
Well, I think Glenn made a perfect reference a few moments ago when he talked about the Seder and talked about the food connected with it, because also linking that with hope. What we found through a lot of studies in talking to survivors is that those who continued to practice their Jewish faith and continue Jewish traditions, even in the midst of the camps, also had a higher rate of survival. And so there was that idea of retaining your sense of cultural identity, because Hitler talked about actually having a museum of extinct races. And he discussed the idea of within that museum would be the Jews of Europe. And so there was a desire to, if this makes sense, even go beyond murder to the destruction of an entire cultural identity. And so whether it is food or faith, those who could try to retain who they were prior to deportation to the ghettos or to the camps had a far greater chance of survival. And it really speaks to just how people respond in the midst of unimaginable suffering, because you really do ask the question, what separated those from the survivors from those who just gave up? And it's fascinating.
So I would love to just have this conversation go on forever. We are getting close to the end of our time. If you're watching, I hope you can put a comment in, let us know your thoughts. And we plan to continue these types of podcasts moving forward. But if you have some thoughts or concerns or questions, we'd love to hear them and maybe address them via email or something like that. But I want to close by just asking each of you to respond to a prompt. And it's so the importance of food and meal beyond just nutrition, right? I mean, nutrition is a huge part of it because that's how we be who we are. That's how we are who we are. But then that also gives us this opportunity to live in culture. And they almost have like this back and forth relationship, culture to food and food to culture, culture to meal and meal to culture. That helps us build identity, who we are. I'm sure we can all remember in our narratives, in the stories, meals that we've had that were important to us growing up, whatever. And what happens when that's taken away? So how do you put all of these pieces together? Like, how does all this become meaningful for us now in our current context? Like, what's a takeaway for people who are watching? How these things all intersect, come together? What's something that someone can walk away with thinking, here's something I learned today and how I can apply it to my life? And jump in any order.
Okay, I'll do this. So one thing people should know is this. We all have different cultures. We're from different places. We've done things in different ways. But a fundamental fact that we in the scientific community now know is food is medicine. For many years, people think, oh, I'm just eating to meet my needs. But now we see research work, body of work that show that there are bioactive compounds in food that on the molecular level can influence our health outcomes. It can interact with our genome and it can influence our health outcomes. Now, the more you learn about food and the crucial role it plays in our health, the better our choices will be. This is not just about, this is how I was raised, this is what we do in our family. This is about what is good for me and acquiring enough knowledge about it to influence what we do and what we pass on to the next generation. But some things might be passed on to you, which you have no control over, but you can shape the outcome for the next generation by learning enough to make choices that would improve health outcomes for generations to come. So
Thank you. That's excellent.
No, I think following up on that, I mean, food is communal, but it's also highly individualized. And so whether we are celebrating with family, whether we're spending time with friends, the idea of eating together and sort of this bringing together of different people and storytelling and opinions is something that is very unique and it's very communal in nature, yet it's also highly individualized. And there's just a very quick story that Primo Levi once wrote about in his book Survival in Auschwitz. Levi was an Italian writer who was actually at one point a bunkmate of Elie Wiesel. And he talked about when it was mealtime, particularly the lunchtime soup, he intentionally bent his spoon a little bit because he felt if his spoon looked different than all the other spoons, then he retained his sense of humanity, dignity, and individualism. And so I think there's a certain aspect of that too in sort of what we eat and how we eat that makes us as individuals who we are and allows us to retain that sense of uniqueness that all human beings want.
Yeah. Great.
I think all I would add to that is that food is not just about the physiological processes, the biological processes, however basic and obviously realistic they are. The mind-body relationship plays a role here. Culture plays a role here, as we've talked about. And so I would encourage people to think about the total picture. Where does food fit into your more holistic approach to life? And I think that will lead people to a better food choices.
Yeah, I all excellent thoughts, and I hope people can walk away with this, at least maybe a self-reflection, interpretation of self, your actions, what makes you an individual, your narrative, where you are in culture, the food that you consume, thinking about it, and also the fact that we're fortunate that we can think about all these things, that we can reflect on our narrative, that our narrative can play out, that we can think about the food that we consume and how culture plays a role in our lives. So maybe not just take that for granted, but think about it consciously and try to bring that into our conscious lives. I'd like to thank everyone for our podcast, again, our inaugural Community of Learners podcast. I'd like to thank Dr. Sherman, Dr. Quinlan, and Dr. Olayanju for bringing their expertise to the table and having this conversation. Hopefully our next podcast will be in fall or spring of next year, and hopefully you can join us then. Thank you so much.
Thank you for all of your work, Ryan, for putting this together. This is outstanding. Thank you.
Thank you.
Till next time.